In 1950, 55 students walked into a classroom at MIT to meet a guest lecturer they had never seen before. Right before he came in, they were each handed a short note about him. Same note for everybody. He's industrious, critical, practical, determined. One sentence, 4 words about the man. Except it wasn't the same note. Half the room got a version that also called him rather warm. The other half got one that called him rather cold. That was the only difference. 1 word. Then he walked in and led a discussion for about 20 minutes. Same man, same voice, same 20 minutes. Everybody in the same room, breathing the same air. Afterwards, they described 2 completely different people. The students holding the warm note found him considerate, good-natured, generous. The ones holding the cold note sat through the identical 20 minutes and came out thinking he was self-centered and humorless. And here's the part that gets me, because it goes past opinion into behavior. The warm students actually talked to him more. They joined the discussion. The cold students sat back. Nobody in that room thought they were reading a note. Every one of them thought they were meeting a person. Hey, I'm Cor. I want to make an argument today that took me an embarrassingly long time to accept about my own life. You have probably never fallen for a person. You fell for a note. And most of the time, you were the one who wrote it. That's what romanticizing actually is. It isn't a personality flaw, and it isn't you being naive. It's your brain doing something it does automatically, constantly, to everyone, including people you have known for years. And the psychology behind it is a lot less flattering than "I just love too hard." Let's start with where the note comes from. Back in 1920, a psychologist named Edward Thorndike was studying something completely unromantic: military officers rating their aviation cadets. He asked them to score each young man separately on things that have nothing to do with each other: physique, intelligence, leadership, character, technical skill. The ratings came back tangled. If an officer thought a cadet had a good build, he also thought that cadet was smart and honest and a natural leader. The scores moved together far too neatly for the officers to actually be judging 5 separate things. They were judging one thing: an overall feeling about the guy, and then filling in the boxes to match. Thorndike called it the halo effect, and it is one of the sturdiest findings in psychology, not a fragile lab curiosity. It shows up over a century of research on hiring, teaching, courtrooms, and grades. Now, put yourself in the officer's chair, because you do this every single day, with faces. In 1972, Karen Dion, Ellen Burscheid, and Elaine Walster showed people photographs of strangers and asked them to guess what those strangers were like. The attractive faces got given better personalities. Not just better looks, kinder, more interesting, more socially skilled, likely to have happier marriages and better jobs. People invented an entire biography from a photograph. But I want to give you the honest version of this, because the internet version is exaggerated. Alice Eagley and her colleagues pooled the research on this in 1991, and the effect turned out to be real but narrow. It's strongest for social skill. It's much weaker for adjustment and intelligence. And for integrity and genuine concern for other people, it's close to nothing. Sit with that, because it's the whole video in one sentence. Your brain will confidently upgrade a stranger's charm from a photograph, and it has essentially no read on whether they will be kind to you. That's the note. It gets written in about a second, from almost nothing, and then you spend 6 months treating it as a description of an actual human being. And once the note exists, something worse happens. You start collecting evidence for it. In 1967, Edward Jones and Victor Harris ran a study that I think about constantly. They gave people essays to read about Fidel Castro, some supporting him, some attacking him, and asked the readers to guess what the writer really believed. Then they added the twist. They told the readers, clearly, that the writer had not chosen a side. The writer had been assigned one, ordered to argue that position. No freedom, no belief, just an instruction. It didn't matter. People still assumed the essay reflected the writer's true opinion. Knowing about the situation barely moved them. That's the correspondence bias, sometimes called the fundamental attribution error. When someone does something, we read it as a statement about who they are, and we quietly delete the circumstances they were standing in. Watch how that plays out on a Tuesday night. He texts back in 4 seconds, so he's attentive. She remembered your sister's name, so she's thoughtful. He was quiet at dinner with your friends, so he's deep. 4 seconds might mean he was bored on a train. Remembering a name might mean she has a good memory. Quiet at dinner might mean quiet at dinner. One honest note, because I don't want to oversell a Western study as a law of nature. Joan Miller found in 1984 that Americans and Indian adults explain the exact same behaviors differently. Americans reaching for personality, and Indians reaching for the situation. And in her data, the gap wasn't there in children. It grew with age. So this is partly something a culture teaches you, not something stamped into the species. It's a habit, which is genuinely good news because habits can be interrupted. All right.
Now the part that made me want to make this video, and honestly, the part that stung.
I have a type. You probably think you do too. Most of us could list it out loud right now. Funny, ambitious, emotionally available, reads books, good with their family. Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel decided to actually test whether that list means anything. In 2008, they ran a speed dating study. First, they had people write down what they wanted in a partner, the whole checklist. Then those same people went and met real humans, 4 minutes at a time, and afterwards said who they were interested in. Then the researchers followed them for a month. The list did not predict anything. The traits people swore mattered had almost no relationship to who they actually wanted after meeting them. And a meta-analysis by Eastwick and his colleagues in 2014, pulling the research together, found the same shape. Your stated ideals predict how you rate a photo or a profile pretty well, and they stop predicting almost anything once you are in the room with a live person. Then, in 2017, Samantha Joel, Eastwick, and Finkel took it further. They ran machine learning on speed dating data. Hundreds of participants, more than 100 questionnaire measures each, everything you could think to ask about a person before they meet anyone. The algorithm could learn 2 things fine. It could tell you who tends to like everybody, and it could tell you who tends to get liked by everybody. What it could not do, at all, was predict the specific spark between 2 particular people. That thing you think you sensed the moment you saw them. That I just knew. The best data science we have, with more information about you than you would ever give a stranger, cannot see it coming. So when you look at someone across a room and feel certainty, that feeling is not information about them. It's a note, written fast, in your handwriting. If this is already making you uncomfortable, that's a good sign. And it's the kind of thing this channel exists for. Subscribe if you want more of it. Now, the obvious objection, and I want to take it seriously. Fine, but what about when it feels enormous? When you cannot stop thinking about them? Surely that means something real is happening. Something real is happening. It's just not about them. In 1979, a psychologist named Dorothy Tenov interviewed hundreds of people about being in love and named a state she called limerence, intrusive thoughts you didn't ask for, a desperate hunger for a sign of reciprocation, reading a message 40 times. She estimated it typically runs somewhere between about 18 months and 3 years, though she was careful to say it can be much shorter, or for some people, much longer. I have to be straight with you here. Limerence is a useful word, not a diagnosis. It isn't in the DSM. Tenov's evidence was interviews, not experiments. But there's a strange piece of biology that lines up with it. In 1999, Donatella Merizziti and her team in Pisa took blood from 3 groups: 20 people who had fallen in love within the last 6 months, 20 people with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and 20 controls. They measured a marker linked to the serotonin system in blood platelets. The people in love came out looking like the OCD group, and both sat well below the controls. The caveats are large, and I'd rather say them than have you find them later. 20 people per group is tiny. Platelets are an indirect proxy for what's happening in the brain. This is a suggestive result, not a settled fact. But hold it loosely next to your own experience of the last time you were consumed by someone, and the shape fits. The obsession isn't proof they were extraordinary. It's a phase, and it has an expiry date, and it is a terrible time to make permanent decisions. Here's where I have to tell on myself. A few years ago, I spent about 3 weeks completely gone over someone I had spoken to maybe 4 times. 4 conversations. And in between them, I was building. I'd imagine how she'd handle a bad day of mine, what she'd be like around my mother. I had a whole apartment furnished in my head, and I did nothing. I didn't ask her anything real. I didn't ask her out for 11 days. I told myself I was being patient. I wasn't being patient. I was full. Gabrielle Oettingen has spent decades on this, and it's the most practically useful research in this whole video. In 2002, she and Doris Mayer separated 2 things that sound identical and behave like opposites. Expectations, meaning you judge success as likely based on how things have actually gone before, and fantasies, meaning you vividly enjoy the imagined outcome right now. Positive expectations predicted effort and success. Positive fantasies predicted the reverse. Job seekers who fantasized more got fewer offers. Students who fantasized more did worse. And the study I can't unsee, students with a crush. The ones who fantasized most about how it would go were less likely to actually end up in a relationship with that person. In 2011, Heather Capps and Oettingen went looking for why. Across 4 experiments, they had people fantasize positively, and then measured their energy, both by asking and by taking blood pressure. Fantasizing about the good version dropped people's energy. Their systolic blood pressure fell, physically calmer, physically flatter. Your body treats the daydream as a small helping of the real thing, so it stops sending you out to get it. Read that back against every hour you have spent romanticizing someone instead of talking to them. The daydream wasn't preparation. It was the thing eating the effort.
Oettingen's fix is unglamorous, and it works. And it's the one thing from today I'd actually put in your hands. She calls it mental contrasting. Picture the outcome you want. Then immediately, in the same breath, name the real obstacle sitting in the way of it, usually something inside you. Then decide what you will do when that obstacle shows up. Not someday, when. Fantasy without the obstacle sedates you. Fantasy with the obstacle attached turns into a plan. Now, why is this so hard to put down, even when you can see it? In 1959, Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills ran an experiment on 63 students who wanted to join a discussion group. Some had to go through a genuinely embarrassing initiation first. Some had a mild one. Some just walked in. Then everybody listened to the exact same group discussion, which had been designed to be as boring as humanly possible. Worthless. Dull on purpose. The people who suffered to get in rated it the best. That's effort justification. And it was replicated a few years later with electric shocks instead of embarrassment. When we pay a high price for something, we don't usually conclude we overpaid. We upgrade the thing, because the alternative is admitting what we spent it on, which explains something that looks insane from the outside. The harder someone is on you, the more elaborate your idealization of them gets. You aren't stupid. You're balancing a ledger. 2 years of anxiety has to have been for someone remarkable. Or it was just 2 years of anxiety. And this is where the whole thing has a cost you can measure. Ted Houston ran a project that followed 168 couples for 13 years, from their wedding onward. He wanted to know what actually separates the marriages that end from the ones that don't. The answer wasn't fighting. It was the fall. What predicted divorce was disillusionment, the fading of affection, the loss of the belief that this person is responsive to you. And the couples most at risk were not the lukewarm ones. They were the ones who had been the most intensely, dramatically romantic at the start, because they had further to fall. That's the brutal part of the title. Romanticizing someone doesn't just make you wrong about them. It builds the exact height that the disappointment will drop from. Okay, I've spent this whole video taking something away from you. So let me be honest about the other side. Because if I stopped here, I'd be lying by omission. Idealizing people is not simply a defect. There's a body of work from Sandra Murray, John Holmes, and Dale Griffin from 1996 that complicates everything I just said. They found that people in relationships see their partners more positively than those partners see themselves. Everybody's a bit rose-tinted. And the couples where this was strongest were the happiest. And in their longitudinal work, the most likely to still be together a year later. Partners even drifted toward the flattering version over time. So idealization isn't the villain. Something more specific is. The difference is where the note came from. Murray was studying people who idealize someone they actually know, someone whose flaws they have seen, argued with, and chosen to frame generously. That is not a fantasy. That's a decision made with the evidence in. What we're doing when we romanticize a stranger, or a version of an ex we've been editing for 3 years, or someone online whose entire life reaches us pre-cut, is the opposite. We're idealizing without evidence. Same emotion, no person underneath it. There's a related idea I love called the Michelangelo phenomenon from Stephen Dragotis and his colleagues. Partners who see and reinforce the person you're trying to become actually help you become it. Notice the direction, though. They affirm your ideal self, not their fantasy of you. One of those is a gift. The other is a job you never applied for, and people can feel it. Being romanticized is exhausting because you know the second you're ordinary, you're going to be a disappointment. And there's one more thing worth knowing before you commit to anyone's note, including your own. In 2013, Jordi Koidbach, Daniel Gilbert, and Timothy Wilson asked more than 19,000 people how much they'd changed in the last 10 years, and how much they expected to change in the next 10. At every single age, people reported that they had changed enormously and predicted they were basically finished. Everyone thinks the person they are right now is the final draft. Nobody is. So the practical version of all of this isn't become cynical. Cynicism is just the same note with a minus sign, written just as fast on just as little. It's this. Notice that you wrote a note. That's the whole skill. When you feel that pull of certainty about someone, ask what you actually have, not what you feel, what you have seen them do more than once when it cost them something, and then go and find out. Ask the real question. Have the conversation you've been rehearsing in your head for 3 weeks instead of having it, because the fantasy was never a substitute for the person, but your body has been treating it like one. The students at MIT couldn't tell the difference between the man and the note. Neither can you in the moment. That's not weakness. It's how perception works. But you get to notice the handwriting. If this landed on someone specific for you, tell me in the comments what you assumed about them before you actually knew anything. I read them, and those comments are usually more honest than anything I could write. I'm Core. Go find out who they actually are.